Chapter 20, Syncopation. Now, the rhythm of music often follows predictable stress patterns. That helps the listener to perceive meter and the beat. Now, stress patterns can be heard on many levels, including the measure level, the beat level, and the division levels. We hear stress when something happens, like when a bass pattern repeats, when a chord changes, when an accented note is played, or when a phrase begins. And there are normal stress patterns in music that are used frequently for certain meters. But when a composer decides to use stress beats or parts of the beat that are outside of these normal patterns, we call the result syncopation. You got to be careful when discussing what you mean by normal stress patterns, as what might be normal for one culture or a particular point in history might be quite different from what is normal in a different culture or a different point in history. Now, the normal that we're talking about here refers mostly to Western music and common practice Western music. So let's talk about what this normal stress pattern is in common time, 4/4 time. Because ordinarily the first and the third beats of a measure in 4/4 time get more stress than the second and fourth beat. So the first beat usually gets more stress than all the others, so that the listener can perceive the beginning of the measure. Here's a chart you can see that shows these stress patterns. So in 4/4 time, 1, 2, 3, 4. Generally, when you're listening to music, the first beat will be a little bit stronger. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the third beat also has a little extra stress. And the weakest beats, or what we call the unstressed beats, would be the second and the fourth. This also happens in other meters, like 2/4 time. 1, 2, 1, 2. Notice I say 1, 2, 1. A little extra stress on the 1. Or in 3/4 time. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. By putting that little stress at the beginning, it causes us to be able to actually hear the meter of 3/4 time. Now here's an excerpt from Mozart's Sonata in C, and it illustrates how the normal stress patterns in 4/4 time might be heard in a piece of music from the classical era. Give it a listen. Now, when we hear this piece, there are several rhythmic points that are marked here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, that really help to establish this quote-unquote normal stress pattern in this music by the way things are accentuated. So let's take a look at each of them. Here at location A, the piece begins with a long note value, right? That's at beat 1. Adds a little stress to beat 1. At B, the melody moves up. The left-hand pattern repeats. At C, the chord changes. Again, this is at beat 1. At D, the phrase ends, and the chord tones change. This is on beat 3. At E, a new phrase begins with a long note value, and the chord changes. That's on beat 1. At F, the chord changes. The melody moves. That's on beat 3. And at G, the chord changes. Beat 1. And at H, the chord changes again, and the phrase ends. That's beat 3. So everything that I just mentioned there happened either on beat 1 or beat 3. And this caused the stress patterns to be placed in those normal positions. So, to create syncopation, a composer works against this pattern by trying to stress the other beats, beats 2 and 4. Now, this can be done with artificial accentuation, which is the placement of actual accent marks on music, or with what we call agogic accentuation. And that's when you change note values or add rests to create a sense of accentuation. So here's an example of agogic accentuation, resulting in just one moment of syncopation in the very famous Ode to Joy that comes from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, last movement. Give it a listen. Now, for the first 11 measures, the melody really exhibits a very normal stress pattern with stresses on beats 1 and 3. It's really comparable to Mozart that we just heard. But Beethoven then does something very surprising. He starts the last 4-measure phrase on the 4th beat of measure 12. See the note with the asterisk. The note is tied to the downbeat of measure 13, creating an agogic stress. The stress has been created on the very unusual beat 4 by an elongated note. That is the first note of the phrase. And then because there's an absence of stress on the downbeat of measure 13, we hear that syncopation. Sing the melody to see if you can appreciate the strong and anticipatory feeling that this syncopation creates. Now, we also have to talk about syncopation on the division level, because it can happen on different levels of music. And if we move to the division level, a new chart of normal stresses needs to be shown here so that we can see how the beat normally receives stress. And you can see by this picture that the stresses are on the beats, or what we call the downbeats. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so the first 8th note of each group gets a little bit more stress than the second 8th note of each group. Now, if you want to create syncopation on this level, composers again will use either artificial stress, that is to add an accent mark, or agogic stress, and that is to change a note value to accentuate the and parts of the beats, right? Those second notes of those 2 8th note groups. Here's an example. You can see the accentuation was placed on the second half of the second beat in both measures, right? And this is artificial accentuation because it was done with an accent mark. You should go ahead and sing this melody and put a little extra stress there and see what it sounds like. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... Now, when notes are elongated by use of a tie or an extended note, this also puts additional stress in the measure. And to create syncopation, the tie or elongated note will start on the second half of one of the beats. And then, more than likely, there will be some kind of absence of stress on the next strong beat. Now here, in this pop song called Oh, You Beautiful Doll, written in 1911, we see a really good example of the increasing use of syncopation in American popular music at the turn of the 20th century. Give it a listen. So in measure 2, the second half of the second beat is tied to the third beat, and that results in extra stress on the offbeat. And in a similar way, the second half of the fourth beat in measure 3 is tied to beat 1 in measure 4. This is really strong syncopation because the normally accented downbeat is anticipated by half of a beat. Other moments of syncopation are here and marked by the asterisks, and they're in measure 10 and 11. You can do Check Your Understanding 20.1 now, and you can look through the music from measures 13 to measures 20 in Oh, You Beautiful Doll, and go ahead and mark any moments of syncopation that you find. Put an asterisk there and see if you can anticipate the fact that that would create a syncopation.